Hello and happy Tuesday evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me tonight. I'm Aaron Sagers. You probably know that since you probably found this link on my Facebook page. But I'm happy that you guys are here. I hope you're doing well on Tuesday night of isolation, lockdown, and quarantining. And want to say hi to a couple people that are in the chat room already that are saying hi. Hey, Kathleen, good to see you. Robin, thanks for joining. Jack's in the house. Good to see you, Jack. Amanda gives me an orange heart. Hopefully that means hello. And also, Stacy gave me a whole lot of emojis, so hello to you, Stacy. So, before we get too much into the topic, I do want to give a shout out to our sponsor. You guys have probably heard me talk about this a couple times already, so let me bring it up on screen. And let's see here. That is Dead Run. Dead Run is a book by Mike Maddox, and it is available only on the Amazon Kindle. And it is a story not quite about zombies, but about perhaps people that are driven by motivations that are not entirely their own. What happens when you wake up on the morning of the apocalypse and you're forced to run or encouraged to run and you can't stop? You run or you die. That's the story of Dead Run by Mike Maddox, available only on the Amazon Kindle. Check it out. I encourage you guys to download that one. So that is Dead Run. And let's get into the topic of voodoo. Now, my guest for tonight, I'm very excited to bring him in. I discovered him through research of my own about the topic of voodoo. I am such an amateur student in it, but I happen to quite enjoy and quite love this topic. It's something that I've read about quite a bit. And this gentleman is indeed an expert and a prolific author on the topic. Let me just go ahead and show a couple of the books that he has written. We've got Hoodoo, Voodoo, and Culture, and a handbook. We also have the Voodoo Encyclopedia, Magic, Ritual, and Religion, which he edited, and also Conjure in African American Society. So definitely a gentleman that I can't wait to get in here. So get your questions ready. I know he is going to be happy to answer some of those. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring in our guest tonight, Dr. Jeffrey E. Anderson. Dr. Jeff, how are you tonight? Welcome to join us on the Paranormal Pop Culture Fireside chat. We're going to talk about voodoo tonight. Yeah, no, thank you for being here. I know we've been kind of chatting via email for a while, and initially I reached out to Jeff to see if he could be a guest at a Comic-Con panel I was going to be doing out in Texas, because I don't know, how far do you live from Dallas? Like a couple hours?
About 5 hours.
Yeah, and we couldn't quite make that happen, but well, this has actually been postponed, so maybe when this thing is ready to go again, we can finally get you out there for a panel. And actually, Jeff, of course I showed some of the books that you had written. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your work, and even how you got interested in the topic of voodoo? And then we're going to get into what is voodoo precisely.
Well, it's really a very unexciting story. I grew up in Alabama, and, I'm just growing up in the country, really outside of a small town. And I got into college, started studying history, found out I really enjoyed history. And I especially enjoyed the history of the Old South and African-American history. And I started encountering some of the books I would read, stories about conjurers or about voodoo doctors. And I'd heard the term voodoo. I mean, most everybody's heard the term. They don't know what it means. And that was really where I was. I had the feeling of, I'm reading about this. I'm seeing the same thing in different books about different eras, and I don't know what it means. So I decided I'm going to do a term paper on it. So I wrote a paper on it, did some research, and I just kind of went from there. I worked on it in graduate school, wrote my first book on Conjure, and lately I've done more on voodoo specifically.
And you're also a professor.
I am, yes. I teach at the University of Louisiana Monroe, African American history, Southern history, and various other things on the side. Teach some courses on voodoo.
Now, when you were growing up in Alabama, did you take some journeys down to New Orleans at all and get exposed to some of the kind of the Mississippi Delta spinoff of voodoo down there?
I really did not. I was in New Orleans one night for about maybe 3 hours when I was on tour. Really not until I got into college with my band, the concert band I was a member of, and we stopped and ate supper there, and that was about it. But I have been down, of course, many times since then in graduate school doing some research, and I've been back, I don't know how many times.
Okay. Well, and we're going to get into this momentarily. Just want to let you know that while the chat room is filling up, so we got Dory here giving us a nice wave. Carly is here giving us a howdy. Billy Ludwig, my buddy, artist, is out there. And then also an old friend of mine, Vivian Lee Croft, is in the room, and she's actually writing a thesis on Haiti. So perhaps this is going to be helpful for her. So with that said, well, let's get into, and actually I mentioned this off air, but I am drinking a cocktail, which is a classic zombie cocktail, which looks like a shrunken head from, classic tiki culture. And what do you have tonight? What are you drinking tonight, Jeff?
I'm drinking a very exotic Dr. Pepper.
Can't go wrong with Dr. Pepper. I don't encounter it. I'm originally from Florida, and I spent a lot of time all around down south. And Dr. Pepper is my go-to, and I don't encounter it enough. So I certainly approve of that drink of your choice. So let's get into. I obviously want to get into Haiti, but basically, I've seen a lot of different spellings of voodoo. Traditional spelling Voodoo. We've got Vodoun, right? So break it down. What are the, simply put, what are the different definitions of voodoo? What do these means? And then even tell me, what does hoodoo mean?
Certainly, there are a lot of different types of voodoo. And when you say voodoo, that has some negative connotations for people. People associate it with black magic, with just evil magic. And that is just not really accurate. There is a whole religion that is part of it. There is magic, to be sure, but voodoo itself is a religion. Now, when you get into the different pronunciations or spellings of it, that tends to indicate where you're talking about. For instance, when you see Vodun or Vodu, you're usually speaking about West Africa, where voodoo originated. When you see Vodou, you're usually talking about Haitian Voodoo. And when you see Voodoo, or sometimes Voudou, then you're speaking of New Orleans Voodoo or Mississippi River Valley Voodoo. People use that term for all the different versions of it, and it's not necessarily incorrect, but it's kind of fallen out of favor when you're speaking of Haiti or Africa. And you go more with the Creole spelling, the Vodou for Haiti, and then the more African spellings that you would find in, say, Benin or Togo for those versions. Now, speaking of hoodoo, in modern day parlance, what we mean there is magic. Hoodoo is a synonym for conjure. That's another term for it. Hoodoo is more commonly found around the Mississippi River. Conjure is found elsewhere in the South and in the North for that matter too. Conjure has faded in popularity over the years. Hoodoo has become the more popular term today. But most people nowadays draw a sharp distinction between hoodoo, which is just magic, and voodoo, which is a religion. Now, having said that, historically, they weren't quite so separate. In New Orleans, for instance, if you spoke with someone who practiced what we today call voodoo, they would most likely have called it hoodoo, and they would refer to themselves as a voodoo. They would say, I am a voodoo, and I practice hoodoo. That has changed just over time. The language has evolved, it's developed. And so now we use voodoo more properly as the name of a religion. And you don't really hear people call themselves voodoos anymore like they did in earlier days.
So they would say that they are a practitioner of voodoo, and they might conduct hoodoo.
Well, not quite. Voodoo historically in the Mississippi River Valley, New Orleans specifically, but you also heard the same kind of thing up in Missouri. They would say, I am a voodoo. In other words, if I practiced hoodoo, I was myself a voodoo. Now, that's not the African usage either. In Africa, Vodou means a god. So a Vodou is a god. And you didn't really have a name for the religion until people are forced to give it a definition, give it a name, when it's coming into that kind of European interaction with the African religions. You have to define it. You've got to set it apart from the rest going on around you. So it starts to be called voodoo, the religion. And so that name is kind of developed differently in different places, depending on the context.
Where is sort of the earliest emergence of what is, even though I know there is like a lot of different variations and kind of a spread of voodoo, what is sort of the earliest emergence of what we would classify as voodoo?
I don't think it is possible to pin down the very beginning of it. So far as place, though, we can pretty confidently say we're talking about the modern day countries of Benin, often called Benin. People in America usually call it that. Benin, Togo next to it. There were some in Nigeria, some in Ghana. That area is where the most prominent elements of what sets voodoo apart from other practices, other religions, comes from. Mm-hmm. Now, it's been influenced by the Congo region of Africa, West Central Africa. It's been influenced by Senegal. But the heart of it is really from that Bight of Benin. That's the kind of indention in Africa that Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria rest on. That area is where it mostly comes from. Mm-hmm. Haiti is where we usually see the influence from in the United States today. But the Haitian version came from Africa.
Right. And what are some of the major differences in, when you go down to New Orleans, it's easy enough to go to any number of stores and purchase items and hear about the version of voodoo down there, the Mississippi voodoo. But what are some of the significant differences between New Orleans and Haiti, and then even some of the other offshoots of it?
Well, I would say, first off, when you're talking about voodoo in New Orleans, you have what you would find today and what you would have found 100 years ago. The living tradition of voodoo, in a lot of ways, died off probably in the 1940s. What you see now, a lot of it is an attempt to revive that voodoo that died out by looking back at the Haitian or sometimes the African predecessor and trying to reconstruct what was in New Orleans. Now, going back historically, you have a lot of shared gods. For instance, Papa Legba from Haiti, and then originally there's a version in Africa as well. And then you have in New Orleans, Papa Liba or Liba, very, very similar pronunciation. You have in New Orleans the god Don, who is the snake god, called Dambala in Haiti, and called Da, Don, or Odon in places like Benin. You have other deities that are shared between them that are very similar in a lot of respects. You have a lot of similar practices, a lot of similar terminology like Wanga. Wanga is a term for a harmful charm that you might say bury under someone's step or use to put a curse on someone. You have the term Gris, which is used all the way from Africa, Haiti, into New Orleans. There are a lot of similarities between them. Some things you don't see that are a little bit different is you don't hear the term Loa, which is the name for a deity in Haiti. You don't have that in West Africa, and you also don't have that in New Orleans. It appears to be unique to Haiti. Now, I can't absolutely guarantee it. It doubtless originated from some African words, but it's not used in that way today in Africa. Likewise, you have in both Haiti and in Louisiana an emphasis on saints. You also see the Bible incorporated in upon occasion, Bible verses incorporated in. You don't have that at all in Africa. if you go and visit, say, a voodoo temple in Benin today, it will look almost identical to what you would see in Haiti, but instead of paintings of gods, in Haiti you have paintings of Catholic saints who represent the gods. The similarities are very profound, but a lot of the surface appearances vary quite a bit, and some of the terminology sounds a little different depending on where you are, much like how the word voodoo is different a little bit in each area.
Now, I'm curious, there seems to be like some flexibility with sort of the deities. Is it true that there's even a god that is actually Muslim but is a deity in voodoo? Is that correct?
That is true. Now, the one I've encountered was actually in Togo, where I encountered it most prominently. I was visiting a temple there, and the last deity they took me to see was one called Gorosesi, which is really more of a family of deities, but Gorosesi, and they described him as being a Muslim, and they say, well, he goes on pilgrimages to Mecca. He doesn't drink alcohol like the other gods do, and it's an odd concept for an American who looks at that as being contradictory almost, but it's not in the mindset that you would see in voodoo. The idea that you don't have the strong boundaries between different beliefs, but that instead things kind of flow freely into it and out of it. It changes over time a lot more than what you might see in, say, Islam or Christianity or another religion that has a sacred text that we base our beliefs on.
You know, I was raised Catholic, and the idea with well, you know, very monotheistic, but the idea of saints is, even if there is, you know, Saint Peter out there, and you may be able to ask for intercession with Saint Peter, he's still this, you know, this character in the heavens. When you say there's a god that takes pilgrimages to Mecca, does the belief system sort of think of deities in more of a physical form, that they're moving about, caring about like normal lives, but they're also being worshipped?
Well, I will say it varies. It's going to depend to some extent on who you speak to and where you're speaking to them. For example, at that same temple that I mentioned, meeting the Gorosesi gods, we went to a shrine for one called Sakpata. Now, Sakpata has a little form on the ground. It's sort of an oval looking shape on the ground. But when the priest travels, he has a separate form of it, a small portable one that he carries wherever he goes. And there is a phrase you'll hear sometimes in Africa that we make our own gods. It's this idea that gods are indeed made. They exist as spiritual beings, but they're also kind of made. So when you make a shrine or you make a little form, they usually do call them fetishes. That is not something I tend to call them, but there they usually use that term for a physical manifestation of the god. When they make those, they consider themselves in a lot of ways to actually be giving that thing power, giving it that spirit. So in a way, it is created. They have stories about when particular gods came to be. Others don't have origins. They were always there. So it varies by the god. Now, I think when you get into Haiti or probably into Louisiana, you have less of the concept that they are physical and more the concept that they're spiritual. But nevertheless, you have stories of Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo queen in New Orleans, that she had a St. Anthony statue, and she would turn it on its head, probably to force that saint, force that deity to grant a petition that she was making to it. And you see that in folk Catholicism as well, or the idea of burning candles, which came from folk Catholicism, but is very much a part of voodoo and vodou today. That comes from the idea of you're making an offering to these spirits. And so in a way, you still have this physical tie, but there is definitely a spiritual concept behind the idea that they do live in a spiritual world.
Right. Now, you know, since we're talking a little bit about, you know, Marie Laveau, I think it's interesting to talk about, you know, in the background here, I do have an image of Baron Samedi from Live and Let Die, the James Bond movie. And we've seen this imagery of voodoo emerge in pop culture. So Marie Laveau was fictionalized in American Horror Story. Papa Legba seems to be a popular character that shows up in popular media and pop culture, because well, you know, he's cool looking, top hat, you know, skull face, cigar. And then there's films like The Serpent and the Rainbow, which is more focused on the Haitian voodoo belief system, or I know I'm missing White Zombie, which is a 1930s movie, which kind of really popularizes the idea of the Haitian zombie or the voodoo zombie. So what are some of the things that pop culture has really gotten wrong about voodoo, so much so that these become part of this incorrect myth, this misconceptions about the belief system?
Well, a lot of it, let me qualify it a bit, but a lot of it is not 100% wrong, but it's picking a small portion of it and making that the end all and be all of voodoo. For instance, you do have zombies. Are they the kind of things you would see in your zombie movies today? No, not at all. You do have the concept of Baron Samedi. And sometimes he is depicted like what you'd see in the James Bond movie. But he's not just a frightening, scary figure. He's also a jokester. He's a lot more than that. So we tend to focus on the things that make for good stories or make for scary stories, things that sell movies. And so we distort it. It's not that there's not a grain of truth, and sometimes more than a grain of truth behind it, but we emphasize what we want to see or what we think others want to see, and therefore we get a caricature of a true religion.
And, well, I mean, okay, so zombies, since we're bringing that up, you know, my understanding of a zombie outside of like the George Romero Walking Dead zombie, my understanding is that kind of the Haitian voodoo zombie tends to be, the neurotoxin in theory, that you know, creates like a zombified state, but it's essentially somebody that's been turned into a slave, into a worker that's under someone's control. Is that what a zombie is? And do practitioners of voodoo believe that these are indeed people who have died and then been brought back to behave as servants?
There is a widespread belief in zombies in Haiti. It's very widespread. When I was there back in 2017, I heard numerous stories about them, and not from the standpoint of there's something out there that we might see one day, but that, no, they're there. They work in the fields. They work for witch doctors. Bocos, as they're called in Haiti. It's not at all a hidden thing. It's not like Bigfoot in the United States that some people believe. It's very widespread, accepted as being fact. Now, so far as what they are, you do have different types of zombies. You have the zombie astral, which is more of a spirit that someone controls, that a Boko, a sorcerer, controls. And then you have the zombie cadaver, which is the kind we think of, the Walking Dead. Mm-hmm. Now, they are usually described as being actually dead. I did have one practitioner of voodoo explain to me how to make zombies. Now, of course, I'm not going to try it, but he told me how to do it. And his definition of it, or his explanation, was you actually have one Boko who kills the person, administers the magical formula that causes the person to die. Mm-hmm. A second one then has to be involved to bring that one back to life. And after that point, they are then this enslaved walking human body that works for you. Now, on the other hand, I heard stories from people who told about zombies returning to their families because the sorcerer died. So the sorcerer died, the zombies were freed from their zombie state and returned home, which is a little bit contradicting the idea that they're always dead. I would just say that people have different understandings of exactly what makes a zombie, whether they're dead, whether they're alive, whether they can be dead and come back to life. It varies. In fact, someone that worked with me in Haiti said that his father had died that way, that he had been made into a zombie. And when we were traveling towards the north of the country, at one point, passed through the rice growing area of northern Haiti. And the people I was riding with said, well, most of those people you see out there, are lots of them at least, they're zombies working in the field. So in their perception, they were actually pointing out zombies to me to tell me, yeah, those are your zombies there. So very common.
Well, and it's interesting to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of certain areas of folklore is the idea of when essentially the master, you know, a vampire, some kinds of demons, werewolves, when they die, the afflicted kind of return to their human state. It sounds like, there's some kind of folkloric DNA with that idea of when the sorcerer dies. The Bokun, you said, when that Boku, like when that dies, when he dies or she dies, a person goes back to their state. And actually, I am curious. MJ popped in the room, and Mariana is from South Africa. She said it sounds like the South African Tokoloshi. Does that ring any bells for you?
It does not. Now, I will tell you, though, ideas like this are widespread. In fact, most people say that the idea of zombies does not come from Benin, like a lot of the voodoo deities do, that it most likely comes from West Central Africa, which is a Bantu people group. It's a large ethnic group. And many of the people in South Africa, the different people groups there, are from that Bantu lineage. So the idea that you would have this concept, I would expect it to be over most of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. And Amanda's in the room. She has a really interesting question. Amanda, hold on. I'm going to throw that up there in a moment. But overall, at least in New Orleans, a lot of people that I've encountered that are practitioners there are many people that identify themselves as voodoo queens, even some voodoo kings. Is that something that's kind of unique to New Orleans version of voodoo? And overall, is it a more matriarchal or patriarchal belief system across the board?
It becomes more matriarchal the further it gets from Africa. In my experience in Africa, and then historically, most of your priests are men, not all, but most of your priests are men. The same is true in Haiti as well, but you have a greater percentage of women practitioners, not just practitioners, but priests, mambos as they're called. In Haiti, when you get to historical New Orleans voodoo, you have more women, and I'm guessing in the range of 2/3 of the priesthood is composed of women. And I just come up with that number by looking at a manuscript produced on voodoo in the 1930s, and I just counted, and it was about 2/3 women, 1/3 men.
You mentioned some people in the U.S. believe in Bigfoot, and it's more of a rarity as opposed to, for instance, in Haiti, where most people would believe in zombies. Now, with that in mind, are there monsters or cryptids or ghosts and demons within voodoo? Are there versions of those things?
Well, yes, there definitely are. And again, it's going to depend on the area where you are. In New Orleans, for example, you don't see it very commonly, but there is some idea that werewolves or loup-garou or rougarou, as they're sometimes called, are connected with voodoo. There are some stories about that being connected. Now, you see the same sort of thing in Haiti as well. They also have loup-garou that are connected. They are a manifestation of witches, which witches are not necessarily the same thing as a boko. A boko is an evil sorcerer, and a witch could be that, or a witch could be something kind of not quite human anymore. They're a little bit beyond that. And you have the concept of shape-shifting witches or evil sorcerers in much of Africa. That same idea is there. So you have a lot of that shape-shifting idea. Now, when you're looking at specifically African forms of Voodoo, then you also have this idea of what most Europeans call witches as opposed to sorcerers. So you have your sorcerers who work magic, who are often also voodoo priests. You have witches that are a separate thing. And they were at one time human, but they have become somewhat less than human over time. And the idea is they always do harm. They're out to cause death, cause sickness, illness, and that's how they gain their power. Pardon me. They kill family members, for example, and by killing family members, that heightens their power. Now, this idea exists in most of sub-Saharan Africa. It is particularly strong in West Central Africa, in the Congo-Kinshasa and Congo-Brazzaville areas. You have a lot of belief in witchcraft, to the extent that you have people murdered for it on suspicion of witchcraft. You have a lot of laws against witchcraft because of the idea that witchcraft is almost like a disease, that it can be spread. It can be administered in a drink and the person who drinks it then becomes a witch over time. So you have those kind of ideas. You have evil spirits out there that inhabit certain areas, certain places. The same kind of beliefs you would see in traditional beliefs in Europe. You have the same kind of things in Africa. A little bit different form, but similar.
So is there, and again, I know there's different variations, different geographies of voodoo, but is there sort of a clear delineation between white magic or sort of the white magic in quotations versus black magic? It sounds like there's the version of the witches and who are doing the bad work or who are thought upon as practicing in evil versus priests that are kind of the good guys.
Well, sort of, but it's not quite like what we would call white and black magic.
Yeah.
Witches, according to most people, and you're still going to find variation with this, but according to most people, a witch does evil magic. Now, some people will tell you that the reason they do evil magic is to protect their family. They might kill a member of their family to heighten their power to protect the rest of their family. So it's almost like they do evil, but in their minds, at least, it's for a greater good. Now, some people wouldn't go that far. They just say, nope, they're evil. That's it. The real difference between this kind of black magic, white magic dichotomy, though, that you would see in Europe versus in Africa is that the priests or even the boko, they're not necessarily only doing good. And it's going to vary by the person. A lot of people, if you go to Haiti and you ask them what do, they will emphasize very strongly, oh, I only do good things. I only do positive things. But you'll talk with others who say, no, I'll do either one. And in a lot of cases, the definition of whether that person is a boko or whether that person is a ungan or mambo, which are the kind of standard priests, is going to depend on the community and how they define them. It might upon the individual, but in a lot of cases upon the community. And you see that same kind of idea in very many parts of Africa, the idea that a priest does good, but they could do bad if they wanted to, versus a witch who does bad.
Right. But MJ is in the room pointing out that she is a practicing witch. Don't worry, we're not saying anything bad about witches.
Yeah, I am using that term merely as a way to communicate what anthropologists, if you go and pick up books, they're going to tend to use witchcraft versus sorcerer, and it's not exactly accurate.
Yeah.
And it really applies to that African context and its historical anthropology, ethnology. Things are moving away from that now.
Sure.
The less of a use of witchcraft. The problem is finding a word to take its place. And so what people started doing is picking kind of the local terms, like in Congo, Ndoki is what your ethnologists used to call witches. Nganga would be what they would call a sorcerer. And so you see that, but it's difficult to talk about the continent because we really don't have a word for it unless we want to adopt that black magic, white magic idea, which is not really a whole lot more accurate than witchcraft versus sorcerer. So it's a problematic thing.
And Amanda brings up an interesting point that the idea of like sort of the binary in magic, white versus black magic, is pretty Western thought in her understanding. And that's kind of my understanding as well. We like to have definitions, clear definitions of things. What about like the idea, the concept of the classic voodoo doll that I mean, like, honestly, in cartoons from a very early age and pop culture that I consumed at a very early age, we were seeing the idea of, you know, sticking a pin in a doll and holding over fire and impacting someone. So how much of that is born out of a legitimate practice of some areas of voodoo?
Well, I would say voodoo dolls are not really a major part of voodoo. It's one of those things that is really European, primarily in origin. The idea of a doll that you stick pins in, that is a European thing. It's a puppet, is what it would be called. You would see it in traditional European magical practices. You do see dolls used, however, in voodoo and vodou. Now, in New Orleans, for example, one way you would know that you had maybe had a curse put on you would be that you would find a doll that represented you in a coffin, miniature coffin on your doorstep. Now, the way it represents you is not by how it looks, but it may have fingernail clippings. It may have some of your hair in it. Sure. It may have simply been named you in a ceremony. So it exists, But the manifestation of it that we think of is a European idea that has gotten more and more popularized in all kinds of movies. Like I always think of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom that has a voodoo doll, but it's in India. It's very strange. But that kind of idea that you see over and over, cartoons, anything you can think of, has made that in how people see voodoo, but it's not really something you would see in actual practice, at least not that form of the doll.
Well, based on my own reading, like a lot of the use of dolls as avatars for humans, for the living, goes back all the way to Egyptian and Babylonian times. So certainly is nothing new as far as these representations of ourselves that are wrapped up in certain kinds of magic. Where have you actually visited? You mentioned you've been to Haiti, and I do actually have some of these photos here. I just want to show. This is Jeff. Where are you in this one, Jeff?
That is in Ouida in Benin. That's the king of Ouida there. He is a very, very prominent voodoo leader as well as a hereditary king in that city. At one time, Ouida was a separate nation, and his ancestors were the king of it. Now it's part of Benin, but he is still recognized as the traditional king.
Okay. And let me clip through. What are we looking at here?
Now, that one, I wish I could show you the full video, but it is a woman possessed of a voodoo job. Now, a job is like a wild Loa or a wild god, and it's kind of like almost a country bumpkin god is what it looks like in practice. And she's been possessed by it, and she actually had just stolen my cell phone.
Huh.
Fortunately, the local voodoo priest got it back for me.
And what's this one?
This is a voodoo ceremony in the temple of a man named Sambael, who was a very prominent voodoo priest in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Now, he is, I don't mean to have a negative connotation for it, but he is kind of like what you might see as a televangelist in the United States. But again, I don't mean that in a negative way, but he's very prominent. He does appear on TV, things like that. And this was just at a ceremony he invited me to attend. And so shortly after this, or in fact, you see the woman there on the left, she becomes possessed by the spirit Azili not long after I took this picture. In fact, she's in the process of it when this picture is being taken.
Wow. Okay. And this one?
This is in Benin. It is a bit north of the coast, well, quite a ways north of the coast. And it's in a small village called Trey. I was going there to talk to the man you see immediately on my right, and he is a local king of that particular village, but he's also a very prominent voodoo priest. The man to his right, or in this picture to his left, is a Haitian voodoo priest who has come there to learn from him, to meet him. And I just happened to show up on a day they were having a graduation ceremony for a group of children who had been instructed in voodoo practices. And so he invited me to come out. And what I'm doing there is I'm getting ready to watch the ceremony taking place. Hasn't started yet. So took a picture, got my translator to come take my picture so I'd have a record of it.
Okay. And then that one.
That is a particular voodoo deity in Benin called a Zangbeto. And the Zangbetos are considered to be protectors of the other gods. And this one was in the process of having the spirit come into it. It's like a hollowed out cone covered with fibers with a little head on top. And they had just sacrificed a couple of chickens, sprinkled the blood on top of it. And what it did is it moved around this enclosure. It periodically flipped over. And each time it flipped over, it had some other representation of itself underneath, like a little statue. At one point when it flipped over, it was a snake, a boa, and then kind of went through a series of things, talked to the priests, things like that.
And, one of the questions that came in, and I think it's a relevant one, and is, well, we're a couple of white guys talking about voodoo. And, and that kind of goes back to Amanda's question. She's, asking if she can kind of push a little bit, but the history of voodoo is being presented in this case and in a lot of cases by basically white dudes. How do you kind of care to this culture that seems to be outside of your own, and how do you remain sensitive to this?
Well, first off, I do have to admit I am not a practitioner of voodoo or voodoo, either one myself. And it has been, though, very, very much misrepresented. And you're going to see misrepresentation from outsiders looking to make money in movies. You're going to see misrepresentation from insiders looking to promote a particular version of it to attract new adherents. And so it's one of those things that is a very sensitive issue. And it's the kind of thing that I face criticism for, that I'm interested in doing scholarly research on it. It's definitely true, but people do exploit it. For a lot of people, voodoo has become one of those things that you pick and choose from on the smorgasbord of spiritual practices. And you create your own spiritual practice. You bring in a little voodoo here because you think it's cool or you like it. Now, on the other hand, I tend to react negatively to what I see as sort of new agey uses of it and not adhering to the tradition, but just kind of picking and choosing what you like. That's just my opinion, though, and I don't mean it as a criticism at all. But I'm always a little bit leery until I get to know the person more and know that, oh, they're sincere about what they're doing. But the other aspect of it is that with Vodun historically, and you're looking back mainly at that African version of it, it is not a religion that has strict boundaries. So, for instance, gods like Don, who becomes Dambala in Haiti, was only one small version of Vodun prior to about the 1720s. He becomes a major part of Vodun when the kingdom of Dahomey conquers the kingdom of Ouida. Kingdom of Ouida was home of Don. They conquer it. They kill thousands of people in sacrifices, sell thousands of people into the slave trade. That's the reason Dahomey wanted Ouida, was to have access to the slave trade, to make money for the king. Well, he, though, adopted Dambala into it. You also see him actively suppress certain deities, suppress certain types of divination because he thinks it's not as civilized as the next country over, which is a Yoruba kingdom at that time. So he begins to adopt intentionally aspects of Yoruba belief. Now, when you're looking at slavery in Haiti, of course, Haiti is the second oldest nation in the Western Hemisphere, established by a slave revolt, which most people say was begun at a voodoo ceremony. Now, some people have questioned that recently, but it's very much a part of Haitian identity. It's very much a part of Haitian nationalism. So when we talk about Haitian Voodoo in particular, it can be a sensitive topic because it is so tied up with patriotism, so tied into nationalism, strong nationalism. Haiti's, in fact, it strikes you just how nationalistic Haiti is. And voodoo is very much a part of how they understand themselves. So I'm not sure if that really answers it precisely, but those are a few things I try to keep in mind looking at it.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned Gris predates like the New Orleans version of voodoo, of New Orleans voodoo. I'm fighting off a cough. I apologize. Too much of the zombie, which is doing its job, I guess. Now, I actually recall years and years ago, someone gave me a bag of Gris, which I later found out, like a little pouch of Gris, which I later found out was apparently associated with a love spell of sorts, which when I found that out, I was very unsettled by. What is the notion of Gris? Where, how has that kind of evolved? And what are typically, what's the purpose of it? Because it seems like there's some for, well, according to the New Orleans version, some that you can buy for increasing your profitability versus love spells versus XYZ.
Well, Gris is a very, very broad term. I've heard it all over Africa. I've heard it in Louisiana. I've heard it in Haiti. And it means more or less magical items, to use a Western term.
Like a talisman?
Well, it can mean that, but it can mean just the magic aspect of it too. A lot of times you do hear it, you hear something called a Gris. And in that case, if you're hearing that article in front of it, you are talking about some form of talisman, amulet, something along those lines. But it's a very broad term. I have not heard a definitive statement about where it came from. I read a book some years ago by Gwendolyn Midlow Hall. She wrote a book called Africans in Colonial Louisiana, and she traced it to the Wolof people of modern-day Senegal. Now, I've done a little research. So a slave trader named Nicholas Owens, I believe it was, mentioned Gregory bags a little bit further south of that, and today what would be Sierra Leone. And so it was being used there in the 1700s. I suspect it was a widespread term.
Mhm.
When I've actually asked people if it is part of their language, they have told me no, it's not. It comes from somewhere else. In fact, I've heard people say, well, it's French. Well, it's not really French. It predates the French presence there, but it's so widespread that I don't think, at least I have not encountered someone who says, yes, this came originally from our language. But that's not, I haven't talked with everybody by any means.
What about the word juju? Is that actually associated with the voodoo culture?
Well, you don't hear it in voodoo itself. Now, it does mean magic in parts of Africa. I believe it is a Bantu word, but you don't hear it, at least not very much, up in the Bada Benin area. But you have very, very similar words that tendency to repeat. Sounds, gris, juju. Hoodoo is very similar. Voodoo, very similar to having a repetition. You often, but not always, see that associated with spiritual practices. But again, I'm not a linguist, so I'm coming at this from a historical standpoint. And who knows, I could be wrong if we have somebody in here who's an expert in language transitions and development.
You know, again, like I've unfortunately not been to Haiti. I would quite like to go and like to speak with so many people over there, but I have been to New Orleans many, many times. And when you go there, there is this kind of commercial component of voodoo. And I'm torn about it because on one hand, you could argue that by going into certain shops and purchasing these items, maybe you're increasing education, maybe and maybe supporting some of the people that believe in that. But there's also sort of the pardon me for saying so, sort of the mass market Walmartization of voodoo that's on display there as well. So how to best, if you're intrigued about this and you want to learn more, how best to shop, how to purchase items, how to explore without being exploitive, without buying, basically things that are really just crass, commercialized versions of voodoo, and yeah, just overall avoiding cultural appropriation.
Well, that in itself is a more difficult question than you might think it would be. Historically, you've really not had a strong separation between the commercial aspect and the spiritual aspect. You have a lot of stories from in the late 1800s of even people like Marie Laveau charging people to come watch ceremonies. They're ceremonies, but they're also performance events. Now, having said that, definitely if you walk around the French Quarter of New Orleans and you stop in a little store on the side of the road that has your voodoo dolls, that is not accurate. That is not a representation of what voodoo or voodoo has been historically. Now, you can have some of your more prominent stores that are devoted just to voodoo. And I will say, when I first started really doing research in New Orleans close to 20 years ago, I would walk into some and the people there would have no idea what they were selling. They'd have no knowledge of it. That has changed. A lot of the shops that are devoted to voodoo, you have actually knowledgeable people, actual practitioners who operate them. And the biggest difference is that you have the real things there, but you also have stuff for the tourists who walk in off the street. So you have the real stuff, you have the tourist stuff. And talking to the people behind the counter in a lot of cases can direct you in the direction you should go. Now, if we were talking a few years ago, I would say go to the F&F candle shop. Mm-hmm. It ended up closing down. The owner, as well as his son-in-law, died in close proximity to each other, not proximity, but close in time to each other.
Sure.
And last I heard, there weren't any plans to open it up. Now, if I am wrong about that, there's been some change. I haven't heard it, but it was a very traditional place. Now, there are a lot of other traditional shops you can find that aren't specifically voodoo shops. You have hoodoo shops, conjure shops in a lot of your larger cities. And the best way to locate them is just go look online or look in a phone book under spiritual supplies or candle shops. And you can often find them that way. I found quite a few that way myself. If you go to places with a larger Haitian population, such as Southern Florida, New York City, you will find in many cases botanicas, which are catering to people practicing Haitian Voodoo. They'll have herbs. They'll have the other curios that you might use in the practice of supernaturalism within that religion. And those are going to be very, very true to what you might have found in Haiti. You might see some changes. You might see maybe some store purchased botanical supplies, for example. But a lot of it's going to look very much like what you would see in Haiti. Otherwise, of course, go to Haiti, go to West Africa. Haiti right now, probably not the safest place to visit. but I'm sure things will get better. A lot of it has to do with the COVID-19, like what is affecting the rest of the world. West Africa is a lot easier to travel in, and you can find a lot of shops there. You can find a lot of temples, and by and large, my experience is that people are very welcoming. It's not that they are against outsiders. They like to welcome outsiders in. Now, they're not going to like somebody to come in and laugh, because that's not what you want to do. That's just bad manners.
Right.
I've read enough accounts historically of people doing exactly that it makes me angry. But for people who are respectful, who really want to learn, who want to see the reality behind it, most people love to have people like that visit, love to talk with people, share their knowledge. So
Yeah.
That's why I recommend go beyond your normal boundaries.
I find that that's just a good tip for traveling overall, is, show up with an open mind and a curiosity and a willingness to learn. And actually, with that said, like Vera, we're winding down, but Vera has a great question, and I want to throw this out here. Vera is asking, Jeff, is there anything that you've learned through your research that you've adopted into your own practices, or maybe even changed the way that you view things in life? And I'm going to add a second part to that. Any maybe items of significance or interest that you picked up along your travels that, that now have importance to you?
Well, I'll just say first off, for anybody who might have missed it, I don't practice voodoo or voodoo myself. I will say I'm a Baptist, actually, and they would probably frown upon it. But I can say that one thing I've really learned doing research is that the things you assume to be true, even when you're trying to come at things from an open mind, a broad perspective, they're not always true. Even when you read in, say, a book of history or a book of anthropology or a book on the religion of voodoo, it's not always accurate. It's when you get out there and you start talking with practitioners that you realize the things you see in a written book that are the way it is, the way the beliefs work, that's one person's account of it. And usually there's a lot more variety within any religion, especially when you're talking about voodoo or voodoo in Africa. There's a lot of variation. You find things like Gorosei, who is a voodoo god, but a Muslim. These kind of things that challenge your Western, your European notions of what is possible or what is normal. And I guess the thing I've taken away from it is coming to understand that things that I think are kind of self-evident or normal or typical are not really. They are typical for an American like me from the place I'm from, but they're not for others. And it's getting that appreciation for the difference that's out there, the variety that's out there, and understanding that what we call typical is not. That's kind of the thing that you can really learn from and really learn to apply. It can make you a lot more empathetic, a lot more understanding of variety, of diversity. Now, so far, some things that I have brought back. This is one thing that's kind of interesting to me. You were talking about earlier the beverage that you brought. This is not a beverage, but it's a voodoo bottle. You'll find these very commonly in Haiti, but you'll find a lot less decorative versions in Africa as well. These are things that you would fill up with herbs, roots, and you typically drink out of it once or twice a day for luck, strength, health, that kind of thing. And this one is one that is tied to Dambala. You can see the snake wrapping around it. Mm-hmm. Also, another item from Haiti, also associated with Dambala, a voodoo flag. You can see the name there on it. I'll hold it up so you can see the whole thing temporarily. But one thing I've really liked about researching voodoo in Haiti is that you do have such a rich artistic aspect to it. Now, that flag is not one that was actually used in the voodoo ceremony. It really is made ultimately for tourists. It's a form of art that people buy, and it is a respected form of art. It's not just like something you'd buy on the street from a vendor. It is a respected art form, but it is an expression of voodoo in art for non-religious purposes. That aspect of it is very interesting to me. You also see carvings of the deities in Benin that you can find. This is one from the city of Abomey in Benin. It is a representation, kind of an atypical representation of Legba. So one of the deities of the crossroads. Not at all the typical look. He's unfortunately been injured at one point. You might see a little broken off part there. But that aspect of it, the sculpture the paintings you see on temples, the voodoo flags, the bottles, just an interesting aspect of the kind of things you encounter with voodoo, the tangible aspect of it.
Have you ever too close or freaked yourself out or beyond your comfort zone?
Well, the only time I was really in a situation where I was a little concerned was in Congo. I was in the Republic of Congo back in 2016, and I'd actually been invited to speak at an English club that was sponsored by the U.S. Embassy there. And after the club was over, the man who had invited me said, "Hey, I know an Ngunza priest nearby." An Ngunza priest is a traditional religion priest. And I didn't know the guy, but I had, spent a little bit of time talking with the man who had invited me to the club. I figured, why not? And so we went down into this man's church, and it was really in his backyard. So it's kind of a church home complex. And just not knowing him made me uneasy. It was after dark, and I was asking him questions about, well, do you guys use graveyard dirt, for instance? Graveyard dirt is very common in Vodou and Voodoo. And I was wondering if they used it in Congo as well. I thought, well, maybe it came from Congo originally. And what he did was, instead of explaining it, he walked back behind his altar, came out with a big cloth, rolled it out in front of me, and all these human bones on it, leg bones, arm bones, vertebrae. And it made me a little nervous. It was kind of a dimly lit room. It was, by this point, about 10 o'clock at night. And I didn't know this guy, didn't know any of the people around me. So it kind of made me a little nervous. But I found out after talking with him, he was a nice guy. He told me he purchased these, and indeed it's very common to purchase human bones in that part of Africa, as well as in Haiti. Haiti has a pretty thriving bone market. They're just taken from the graves, sold for making various kind of charms, and sometimes, sadly, sold to tourists who just think it would be cool to own a human skull. Do not approve of that at all. But the idea is you're calling on these ancestors. The ancestors are helping you out in some way or another. It's not a scary thing. In the belief system, it is a connection to the past, a connection to those who came before. But I was a little uneasy. It was very different for an American like me.
Well, and I do want to just bring up some of your work before I let you go. I've kept you for an hour, but there's the Voodoo Encyclopedia, which you edited, and a collection of a lot of different scholars contributed to this, correct?
Yes.
And we have Hoodoo, Voodoo, and Conjure. That is a book that all of these you can are available on Amazon. I would say you guys check this out. Also, Conjure in African American Society. And I also, we have your Facebook page up there, facebook.com/jeffrey.anderson.9231. Correct? We got that right?
I believe so.
And yeah, I mean, just overall, Jeff, this was such an informative talk, and I know everybody out there really enjoyed it. Seeing some comments of people saying this could go for 2 hours, and I agree. We won't keep you for 2 hours, but this just barely scratches the surface of your knowledge, and it's really fascinating stuff. So, Jeff, thanks so much for hanging out and answering all of our questions, and just being such a good sport about everything. Any final words or anything that you want to get out there?
Well, I'd just like to say thanks for having me, and also thank you to those who asked some questions. I really enjoy answering the questions, and to me, that's one of the most enjoyable things, meeting people who are interested in the subject matter and being able to talk about it with them. So thank you to those who tuned in, who asked some questions, and give me the chance to respond to them.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much. I'm going to kick you out of here and then say goodbye to everybody. But thanks again, my friend, and let's meet up soon in person and do a con together.
Hey, sounds good. Have a good night.
All right, see you later, Jeff.
See you later.
And that was Dr. Jeff Anderson. Such a good sport, such a great guy, and someone that is fairly new in my world. We just recently met, and I'm so happy to have met him. Now, for you guys, thanks for joining. Look, you know the deal. Say hi to me on Twitter and Instagram at Aaron Sagers. I'm doing the Nightmarica podcast. New episode dropped tomorrow. New episode, but all the episodes are out there. Please check those out. That's available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. And this week we are talking about haunted bars and music venues. Last week was theme parks. So all sorts of exciting topics. I hope you guys check it out. And beyond that, I do want to say this is like a little bit of like a new thing. I don't know if you guys have seen on social media. I am training to run the New York Marathon in November. It's my first marathon, and I am doing it for the East Side House Settlement. It's an educational charity based in the Bronx, right here in New York City. And typically, when you do these marathons, the charities that you run for, that money is helping fund them for the following year. Well, because of the crisis that's going on right now, any money that people are donating helps them now. It helps kids, underprivileged, low risk, or at risk, low income kids get educational tools right now so they can do some at home learning, do remote learning. It also helps their entire family, helps feed them, put food on their plates, helps with some rent assistance, helps educate their parents so that way their parents can become competitive and really get out there into the economy and really survive. I'm such a big fan of education, and I'm a person that did not come from a wealthy family. I benefited from education, and I'm so happy to be running for the East Side House Settlement. So that's a very long link right there. However, you can find it on my Instagram. I posted on social media. If you are able, throw some money that way. It goes straight to them. And beyond that, keep an eye out for some other activities that I'm going to be doing, some fundraising activities. And if you have ideas for how to raise funds during this weird isolation time, please let me know, because I could use any suggestions that you may have. Also, want to say again, big thanks to to Mike Maddox and Dead Run. The folks at Dead Run are indeed supporting this podcast, and want to throw Dead Run by Mike Maddox, available only on Amazon Kindle. Please download it. It helps us keep doing what we do here. And aside from that, any final questions? I think you guys have put all the words out there, and I appreciate you guys hanging out here, hanging out with me, listening to Jeff, and go say hi to him on Facebook and pick up some of his books. We've just barely scratched the surface. So wherever you guys are, I hope you take care of one another. I hope that we stand together by staying apart. We're still kind of working on this whole thing, and socially distancing is a good thing right now. So you guys take care. I am going to be back tomorrow, and I'm actually going to be back with someone from New Orleans, and we're going to be talking about ghost stories and vampire culture and all sorts of cool stuff. My buddy Lord Chaz Howell is going to be joining me, and he's pretty much one of the first ghost tour operators out of New Orleans. So you guys show up for that. I know you're going to have an amazing time. He's going to tell some really killer, maybe literally, stories. So show up for that. You're going to love Chaz. He's one of my favorite people. So guys, thank you so much. MJ, thank you for popping in from the UK at 3 a.m. All right, guys, you have a great night. Be safe and stay weird.